Yes. Thank you. Dumelang. Exe. Eta. Hola. How's it? Yeah, good. So, greetings to all of the speakers, the panelists, points of divergence, points of conflation and agreement, but always deep and mutual respect. And love to all of us here on the commemoration of Sharpeville massacre. So I've got a couple of points of departure and divergence with which I want to frame this particular piece, this particular offering on this day. And I want to ask a question. The question, I'm going to walk around, I'm so sorry, I have to. When I get, yeah, in heels, huh? So I want to ask a question. What is a sellout and what is its genesis? What is its intention and what is its way of being? Who is responsible for it? And who was responsible for selling a nightmare dressed up as a rainbow dream? And for subverting days like this one? Days like the commemoration of Sharpeville and Langa massacres. So I've been doing a lot of reading and writing on history. So I think that the previous speakers have given us an excellent platform around the recent politics and the recent economics and concessions and structure, architecture of the 1994 transition, which saves me about 4 minutes. I want to contend that memory itself is a human right. What we are enabled to recollect and the way that we're enabled to recollect, including who sold, what was sold, and what was at stake. I think it's also very important for us to remember that memory is an expression of universal humanity, all of our humanity. It's very important for us to understand that these cannot be isolated to an individual, to a chap or a chapette. It cannot be isolated to one event. This has to be situated between structural, systemic, political, economic questions of power, the ceding of power, the transfer of power, the refusal to cede and transfer power. Some of the tensions that previous speakers have spoken about, and we are constantly wrestling with these tensions, the tensions between the past and the present, the tensions between what is and what is not, the tensions between what should be and what actually is. Now, on this day, I'd be doing a great disservice if I didn't go into the dusty history archives for a minute or two. So I want to suggest that one of the first punk out moments or sellout moments or concession moments would probably be 1955, the Kliptown Charter. And this is really the moment where there's a point of departure between the Africanist bloc, and remember that everybody was in the ANC Youth League then. So Mr. Mandela, Mr. Sobukwe, Mr. Tambo, Mr. Mda, etc., etc. These people were all compatriots and comrades together. But basically, this point of departure is really to do with what had birthed the Defiance Campaign. The Defiance Campaign was a moment for us to think about how we are going to, as African people, claim back our personhood. Who here is holding their ID book? It's not a trick question. Who's holding their ID book? We hold it for all kinds of reasons. Okay, so remember that the ID book is a successor of what? So the passbook was a symbol of black person's personhood. You could not be a human being and present in white spaces without this symbol of a personhood. And we hear stories about people whose lives were put at risk, who died in flames of their homes, racing to excavate this little symbol of their personhood as black people, as African people in this country. So we have to understand that the idea of defying a white capitalist construct of black person's personhood as being to the service, the chattel of white families, white farms, going down white-owned mines, even though the minerals do belong to black people, but going down white-owned mines must not be negated. And that the demands that were made at Sharpeville, when Sobukwe called for people to put down their passbooks, he was calling for them to claim back their black personhood. Okay. So this was actually a powerful assault on white capital. It was a powerful assault on the right to be, the right to exist, and the right to frame ourselves other than in a white person's imagination. and to remove the white gaze from black person's personhood in this country. And Frans Fanon has called this the 17 days that shook South Africa and in fact shook the world, and are still shaking the world in different ways. Okay? So I think that 1955 represents the first kind of punk out moment. The second would probably be 1961, where certain factions of what was formerly, Bra Ezra, okay? Friendly face. Where, this was a collective call. History should record that this was a collective call. The call to put down passbooks was made to all political parties, to all social formations, and to all social movements. And one party decided not to participate in this. And a week later, Ntate Albert Luthuli then subsequently went to present himself just after history had passed him by. Just after after the days had shaken the country and shaken the world. Just after people in Sharpeville and Langa had already been martyred to also claim back black personhood. Late, very late. My third point of departure is how and where we house history and memory. And I was very impressed when I sent my remarks of what I was going to say to Ms. Wade here, Davy. And I was like, this is my critique. I'm very uncomfortable in this space. I'm uncomfortable about the way this part, places like the Freedom Park, places like Apartheid Museum, the way that they narrowly curate a particular version of history, her story, our story. I came here, the last time I was here intentionally was like 12, 14 years ago for some post-grad studies. Sobukwe was spelled wrong. And I'm gonna walk around this evening and make sure that Sobukwe has since been spelled correctly. This is very important. It's very important, okay? And I think that also understanding that there's a very contested history to the origins of this particular museum. Most of us know Mike Steinberg, and he has said a few things about how he feels that the Klok brothers usurped this space, this idea of how memory should be curated from him and from the black population, from the African imagination. So I think these are very important things for us to locate ourselves within. Thirdly, I think that it's also important that the TRC, which has been eloquently alluded to already, as part of the curation of a dishonest, problematic, and parochial approach to the past, comes into the frame. And it owes its being to the legacy of concessions made during the negotiated settlement and has institutionalized mistruths and anti-history, curated by Ntate Dudu, Ntate Mandela, et al. And I believe that a platform to create, to speak truth and create honest dialogue about the causes and consequences of colonial apartheid atrocities, instead absolved white capital and white atrocities, institutionalized race oppression and colonialism, and then it forced us as Africans into this microwaved forgiveness and this collective amnesia, and yet history doesn't forget. That is why when people ask, why are you so angry as black people? Why are South Africans so angry? You need to ask. So I think that official history has decided that nobody is culpable. So that's the next sellout, punk out point. That official history decides that nobody in particular is culpable. It decides that, the freedom fighters and their oppressors are on par. What nonsense is that? Nobody could go to Nuremberg and say that the Nazis and the Jews and all the other people who were in concentration camps were on par. And it should be remembered that elements such as Chase Manhattan and others helped to rescue the apartheid regime back in 1961. Bank of America, First National Bank of Illinois, to the tune of 100 million pounds at the time, and which is worth, I don't know, billions right now. This is very significant because if that had not happened, South Africa would have become a democratic, liberated space in 1961 or 1962, the latest. Journalists such as Alistair Sparks and so many others have written and said that all of the conditions of Sharpeville and Langa mass uprisings were conducive to the immediate transfer of power from African hands, from black hands, from white hands to African hands, immediately. Instead, we had to wait, hope deferred, for 34 bloody years for something esinyona, not quite even there. Okay? So I want to ask, what are the critical elements in closing of this purported revolution in deliberate snide commas? And what benchmarks are set to evaluate it? If this constitutional democracy and the electoral system that underpins it represent the reversal of the previous political power relations, then we're in trouble because they don't represent corrective justice. And they don't represent new economic power relations. They have absorbed the existing power relations. They have continued to privilege. And I'm of the opinion that this constitutional democracy is a deep obfuscation and obscuring and intentional diversion from liberation politics. It actually depoliticizes freedom. We have just emerged from 10 years of a constitutionally enabled dictatorship. Call it what you want, but that is my contention. However, it is not entirely fair to lay a portion of blame to one person. Even though Mandela called the free market economy, which I don't have the time to go into, a magic elixir, and argued that it presented the only hope, and wrongly argued, I argue, the only hope for creating a prosperous and just new South Africa. I still don't think that we can lay a portion entirely to him, even though in many respects he and others like him were mascots for this project. I would argue that the moderate allies of whom the ANC historically and people like Mr. Mandela, Mr. Sisulu may have represented were then supported by a few key elements. And I argue that systematic, structural, political, economic, and imperial power relations are usually about the elongation of their power, the elongation of their influence, the elongation of their presence, tangible or intangible. Number one, this is through the production and distribution of the economy. Number two, through the control over and production of media and ideas. Number three, the production of ideas in academic spaces. Fees must fall and colonial curricula must fall. And number four, the control of social and political ideas of race-based entitlements using fancy instruments such as the law and such as the Constitution. So empowering black people, oh yes, the elongation of the National Party of Chase Manhattan, of people like Cecil B. Rhodes, of Lonmin, and so many others, among others, are still daintily secured in today's South Africa. Which is why, when there was a massacre called Lonmin, it reminded us of who? It reminded us again of Sharpeville. 30 years later, and still we're 40, 50, almost 50 years later, and still we're being mowed down by people who look like us, which shows that white interests can indeed metamorphose and wear a black face. And finally, I want to argue again, who was bought and who was sold off? Memory and the silencing of the less comfortable versions of ourselves, of our recollections, I think is a continued instrument of oppression. Different forms of oppression, discursive oppression, ideological oppression, race oppression. And this includes the ignominy of negotiation with and accommodation of minority whites, usually white minority interests. Proclamation must be a part of liberation. It has to be. We must speak it out. And silence is the part of the sellout. Silence and erasure are part of the real sellout. Misappropriation of voice is part of the real sellout. So I go back to my initial question. What is a sellout? And what is its genesis? Its intention and its way of being. Who was responsible for selling a nightmare dressed as a rainbow dream and for subverting days like this? I want to end with two quotes. I'm not going to say who they're from. You can think about it or ask me about them during the Q&A. The one is, the oppressors do not favor promoting the community as a whole, but rather selected leaders. The other is, we are witnesses today of a cold and calculated brutality, the desperate attempts of a dying generation to stay in power. Maibuye.